So the next principle that we're going to look at in this lecture is that of emphasis and subordination. You could think of emphasis as that which is in a work of art that gets our attention, and subordination would be the aspect of the work of art that gets our attention less, that has less of a draw on our eyes, but actually supports the area of emphasis. The emphasis would be the focal point, the main area where the eye lands after it goes through a painting. Now we're going to look at a couple of images that are either similar or related to the ones in your textbook or are the ones in your textbook. And this one, the Banjo Lesson by Henry O. Tanner, is a very famous painting by an American Impressionist. Now one of the things about Henry O. Tanner is that he was a man of color, and during the 1800s he had to go to Europe really to make his name, but he's considered one of the finest American Impressionists. In this piece you can see the emphasis is on the two figures and the great care that the grandfather or the banjo teacher is giving to the young boy. Notice how the artist uses contrast. You see how the areas of black and white are closest together on the forms, and yet in the rest of the piece, in the background on the right, you do not see that much contrast. Also notice how there's some kind of a jacket or something hanging up on the left side of the piece, and how this draws the eye right to the area of emphasis. So the emphasis is where we're supposed to really look according to the artist's intentions, and the area of subordination would be a less developed area so that we can let our eye rest on the focal point. Now in your textbook you had a still life by the artist Paul Cezanne. Cezanne is considered to be one of the fathers of modern art. While this art might not look revolutionary to you now, it was very revolutionary for its day. This particular piece is a still life very similar to the one in your book, except for that, of course, it has a skull in it. And I wanted to bring that in order to talk about focal point and about how that area of emphasis will shift when we see a familiar shape like a skull. Again, just as in the textbook, he's used this white piece of fabric to really draw your eye to a certain area of the painting. But then here you also have the sort of delight of the skull. Well, that sounds odd. You know, you sort of have the adventure to look at the skull and explore that shape. And I want you to notice also how there's a rotten pear or apple in the foreground. You see that sort of bad spot on the piece of fruit that really mirrors the eye sockets and the nose of the skull. So in addition to making a still life here, the artist Cezanne is sort of making a statement about life. Now we've already talked about Francisco Goya. He was the artist who was the court painter for the Spanish royalty, and yet he was extremely distressed by all of the injustices that he saw. So, you know, sort of by day he would paint these really boring portraits of kings and queens, and by night he would make incredible subversive art. So if you look in your textbook, on page 129, there is a very famous painting by Goya called The Executions of the 3rd of May. And what we see here is a painting by the artist Manet, the one who we just saw, the barmaid. He did that painting, and Manet also did this one. The reason that I'm bringing it into this discussion is that he obviously is doing this, fashioning this after the work of Francisco Goya, and I invite you to look at them side by side. In both cases, the area of subordination is the person being executed, and in both cases the artist has used extreme lights and darks in order to bring our eye to that area of emphasis. Now, one of the interesting differences about Manet's painting is the way he's put the white sashes on the guard, and that part of that could have been being, you know, real to the uniforms that they would wear, but it also creates a little different energetic when we look at the painting. Now something else that I want you to notice also is that in both cases, and in the case of Henry O. Tanner, the Banjo Lesson, the emphasis is on the left, toward the left side of the painting, so that our eye will then travel from left to right. And notice how Manet's used that angled gun stock to kind of draw our eye out of the painting. So that is emphasis and subordination. And next we're going to look at scale and proportion. So let's take a look at the principle of scale and proportion. Both of these relate to the size of an object. The scale relates to it sort of in relation to a standard or a convention, and proportion relates to the parts of the whole. The proportion refers to how one aspect of a composition relates to another. Now here we have an example of hierarchical scale or of grandiose scale in this piece by the artist Klaus Oldenburg. Now Oldenburg is also featured in your book in the giant trowel, but here we have the giant clothespin. I find this one really interesting because he did it in 1974. It's in Philadelphia, and in writing about this particular piece, he said that it demonstrates the principle of love that was going to bring the world together. So Oldenburg saw in the two halves of the clothespins being stuck together something that reflected his view of humanity. Oh well, he's an artist. He can say that if he wants to, huh? Now let's look at an example of odd scale, or you could say non-intuitive, non-rational scale. And this is by the surrealist artist Rene Magritte. And it's called, it's called Objects for Living or something like that. Priorities for Life. What it is, let's see, there's the giant wine glass, the giant comb, and the shaving objects all on the little bitty bed. Oh, I guess there's a match there too, so he must be going to have a cigar or a pipe or something. So this shows the artist really playing with our idea of what is natural and how a scale should be. Oh, I guess I've not yet mentioned that the room has a wall of clouds. So what he does is he takes what we expect to be rational and logical and he just turns it on its ear. So that's one example of messing with scale, of changing scale. Now let's look at what is true hierarchical scale in the palette of Narmer from Egypt. Now this is interesting because it's actually a little makeup dispenser thing. If you turn it over, it's got a circle, and it's the men who were ruling, the pharaohs, would have these to put their kohl in them, or the black stuff that they put around their eyes. But what matters about the palette of Narmer here is that it's a great example of what we call hierarchical scale. Notice the big guy in the middle? Well, he's the pharaoh. And notice that behind him are smaller figures, and below, these are sort of lesser people, his subordinates, the soldiers in his army. So throughout the ancient world, they used this convention of making the important people bigger and the less important smaller. And this is an example of that. There's another example in your book from Egyptian art that's more about proportion, where it's all the same, where everyone is the same height and all looks the same. Let's look at another proportion. This is called the Spear Bearer by the artist Polykleitos, and it's one of the great works of Greek art. But more than that, this fella is considered to be the convention, the canon of proportions, they call it. So in other words, if you want to know what the idealized figure is to recreate an art, it's him. And he was also, this was true in Greek art, and he was also used as the canon of proportions when we look at the art of the Renaissance. So this particular sculpture is very important in the history of art because it has a proportion that is seen to be idealized. What I mean by that, the length of his arms in relation to his legs. He's exactly 7.5 heads high, which is considered to be an ideal, and on like that. So let's look at one more proportion, and this one is in your book and in our movies. It's called the Golden Section. I do want you to be sure and watch the movie on the Golden Section. Well, it's a classic, and it's going to have a lot of information, really more than I can explain here. But let's look first at the image on the left, which is A Human Being by Leonardo da Vinci. It's called the Vitruvian Man, and it exhibits an idealized proportion. Now look at the shell on the bottom right. They both reflect something called the golden section, which is actually a proportion of 1 to 1.613. And don't worry if this doesn't make sense. Watch the movies and it'll make a lot more sense. But what is important to note about this proportion is that it's repeated throughout nature, throughout our bodies, over and over again. Just to make it simple, the longest section of a finger from the knuckle to the first joint is, and the next one from the first joint to the next joint, looking at your finger, the shorter section is 61.3% the length of the longer section. And I think that's really confusing, but if you watch the movie, it'll make sense. So let's see. Next up, we're going to talk about rhythm, and that'll be it on our Principles of Design. So the last place that we'll visit on our little journey through the Principles of Design is that aspect of rhythm. What you're looking at here is a wall by the artist Andy Goldsworthy, who we've already talked about quite a bit in the class, and who you will have the opportunity to do a project inspired by. This is a wall in Storm King Sculpture Park, which is in upstate New York. And here's another view of it. In this wall, he's created a wall simply for its own sake, rather than having it actually block off a field. Now you could say, why in the world would he do that? Well, I invite you to notice how beautiful it is, and what a sculptural work of art it is in its own right. In the Goldsworthy movie, he talks about working with the Wallers in the traditional dry stack stone of upstate New York, which is where this is located. So now at the same sculpture park in upstate New York, where we see the Goldsworthy fence, we have this work, The Wave Field by Maya Lin. And this one is a more obvious example of rhythm in art, and it's the one that's cited in your textbook. In this case, she has repeated these rhythms when she's talking, and when she speaks about this work, the artist Maya Lin says that she's actually recreating this sort of feeling of waves on the ocean that she wanted to do in the land. Now, another one from your textbook is this screen. It's a Japanese screen by the artist Kiho Yusho. And in this one you can see that there's very different rhythms. We have the rhythm of the screen itself, the rhythm of the fish nets, and the way that the bamboo comes in from the side and creates its own rhythm. And you know what we'll find when you look at art is that really all of art has a rhythm of its own, just like all music has a rhythm, whether it's consciously brought up or not. In speech there's a rhythm, and in art we do have a rhythmic aspect. In this one from your book, that's also cited in your book, is by the artist Paul Klee. And here we have several different rhythmic elements repeating themselves. We have the yellow birds, we have this sort of, I don't know, wedge-shaped boomerang looking things, and then we have the red of the tropical sort of landscape in the background. And all of these rhythms go together to make a cohesive whole. Here you can see, if you look at the circle of the kind of moon in the right, upper right, then you can see what I said earlier, that a circular shape really draws your eye in a composition. And the last rhythm we'll look at is from the cathedral at Sainte-Chapelle. The cathedral uses repetition of these shapes that draw the eye upward in order to have a feeling, to create a feeling of upward, of looking upward towards the divine. Now that really wraps up our lecture on the principles of design, and I just want to ask you also to read the last pages in the chapter beginning on 136, the summary, because there's a lot of valuable information in there. Now here we have an image just to kind of remind us all that even though art can look like a beautiful finished piece, maybe not quite accessible, when you look at the principles and the structure for how it is created, It's something that we can all do, and that is really truly accessible to everyone. All right, thanks for listening.